This video will contain fairly minor spoilers for Zorba the Greek and the film Pineapple Express. Never before have I felt so thoroughly and personally attacked by a film, book, or any other piece of art than I felt while I was reading Nikos Kazantzakis' novel, Zorba the Greek. It's worth mentioning that Zorba was not the first of Kazantzakis' novels that I discovered. Like a lot of people, I began by reading The Last Temptation of Christ, almost certainly the most popular of Kazantzakis' books, thanks in no small part to the film adaptation from Martin Scorsese, as well as the controversy stirred up by evangelicals in response to both the book and the film. It's not relevant to what I'm talking about, but it is interesting that apparently this controversy went as far as an arson attempt on a theater that was playing the film in Paris on opening weekend. So I avoided Kazantzakis' work for a while due to this obvious controversy. I wouldn't describe myself as a particularly religious person, so I wasn't really all that interested in reading something that seemed to me to be little more than a theological debate piece. However, I couldn't have been more wrong in my characterization of the book. Instead, what I found in The Last Temptation was a beautiful and challenging description of one of the best-known stories of all time. Kazantzakis' ability to paint a picture of Bible-era Judea that seems to challenge the traditional view of the place and time, but also cement itself as the definitive description of the place, is perhaps the most incredible thing about this book. Of course, that doesn't even mention the depiction of Jesus in the novel, which is probably the most interesting that's ever been put on page, and a depiction that I think can be enjoyed by believers and non-believers alike. If you're vaguely interested in the story, but not really sure if it's for you, I would recommend skipping the Scorsese movie and just reading chapter 7 of the book, which I'm sure you could find online for free, easily. This chapter demonstrates quite well what the book has to offer, both in terms of Kazantzakis' writing and the controversial way that his character of Jesus behaves and thinks throughout the story. It also just happens to be, I think, one of the most beautiful passages that I've ever read in any book. I bring up The Last Temptation only to mention that everything that's amazing about that book, or the fratricides, or any of Kazantzakis' other work is also present in Zorba the Greek. Kazantzakis is quite similar to other late 19th and early 20th century authors in that themes like freedom, the interplay between good and evil, and suffering for the sake of suffering are all present in his work. Zorba, of course, being no exception here. However, while reading Zorba, I had an odd experience in that the book wasn't quite striking the same nerve for me as Kazantzakis' other writings. It was difficult to articulate exactly what my hang-up was, as every other chapter in Zorba had some idea that I connected heavily with, or some beautiful description of the most mundane thing that I loved reading, or a line that stuck in my head for the next several days. Yet, I spent virtually the entirety of my time reading this book, sort of fighting against it. It took me until nearly the end of the book to fully realize that this was probably because Kazantzakis had basically dedicated an entire book to heavily critiquing my own way of thinking about the world. Zorba the Greek isn't exactly tackling ideas that are new in art. On its face, Zorba the Greek is basically a buddy comedy where dual male protagonists become the best of friends over the course of the story. In some ways, it's even similar to something like a Pineapple Express or Hot Fuzz, in that two acquaintances are basically forced to become much closer through the events of the story and end up becoming friends by the end.
What about Lethal Weapon?
No.
You seen Die Hard, dude?
No.
Bad Boys 2?
No.
You ain't seen Bad Boys 2?
There is one pretty major difference, though. In the case of Pineapple Express, you have two protagonists. Dale, a slacker but a kind of sort of put-together adult who really likes getting high, and his drug dealer Saul, who is maybe the only person who is more apathetic and lackadaisical than Dale. When the story starts, Dale is basically trying to escape his relationship with Saul, but can't because he still really wants to buy weed from him. By the end of the story, Dale ends up risking his life to save Saul, but their friendship does grow out of a very mutual sacrifice and evolution. Both characters have their own flaws, though often quite similar flaws, and both are forced to change in not so subtle ways and step outside of their comfort zone in order to survive, but also to accommodate their newfound best friend. In the case of Zorba the Greek, there are again two protagonists, though they don't actually meet until the first chapter of the book. You have Alexei Zorba, who is a sort of vagabond who convinces the unnamed protagonist, who is almost certainly just Kazantzakis himself, to take him under his employ on a trip to Crete. The film adaptation refers to the unnamed protagonist as Basil, and I'll do the same for the rest of the video just to make things easier. Basil is a writer and an intellectual who is to some extent trying to break a cycle of chasing knowledge and embrace a life with more worldly experiences. The entire reason that Basil is headed to Crete to start his coal mine is a result of this effort. Zorba, of course, is the complete opposite of Basil. Vagabond, classless, a quintessential man of action, and fervently anti-intellectual. But while in Pineapple Express, both of our protagonists have to change and learn lessons, in Zorba the Greek, the evolution is almost completely one-sided. Basil is the one doing virtually all of the learning and certainly all of the evolving. Of course, here's where I have to admit that Basil suffers from basically all the same character flaws that I would attribute to myself. The foremost, an almost crippling tendency towards procrastination. But at the start of the book, it's not as if Zorba is presented as some sort of psychological guru who we're meant to be learning from. Zorba is thoughtless and impulsive, yet Kazantzakis goes out of his way to suggest that Zorba's way of life, blatantly anti-intellectual and embracing stupidity, or as Zorba would call it, folly, is to be admired and probably emulated. It's actually a bit odd to read something written by someone like Kazantzakis, who's clearly well-read and intelligent in his own right, that goes out of his way to detail how intelligence can lead to a person's downfall, and suggests that folly is actually a required ingredient in living a life of purpose or action or whatever else you want to call it. However, hating so-called intellectuals isn't even all that uncommon of an idea in fiction. I noticed while reading The Brothers Karamazov that Dostoevsky, who predated Kazantzakis just barely, also seems to lean into the idea of bashing intellectuals. A quick web search of Nobel Prize syndrome will reveal that no one is immune to suffering under the influence of bad ideas, regardless of their perceived intelligence. And it's not exactly a far journey from that realization to find yourself in a spot like Dostoevsky or Kazantzakis did, where you're openly questioning the value of intelligence, or at least recognizing the potential downsides that come with it. In Zorba the Greek, however, Kazantzakis seems to be taking a step further than that. It actually seems like the same anxiety that would lead someone like me or Basil towards inaction or procrastination acts in reverse on Zorba. Zorba is absolutely every bit as terrified of inaction as a procrastinator would be of action. Of course, it's worth clarifying that in the mind of Alexei Zorba, action and intelligence seem to be at a war with one another. There is no having both. In order to act, you have to be willing to be, well, stupid. It is possible that Kazantzakis isn't making the case that there is no place in a productive life for the pursuit of knowledge, but he certainly could be. At the end of the story, Basil attempts to do what anyone like Basil, or anyone like me, would attempt to do: embrace the philosophy of Zorba without completely abandoning his own quest for intellectualism. But this, of course, doesn't work. Basil fails to fully achieve Zorba's same blind, action-oriented energy and seems to forever regret this. It seems that much like Zorba, Kazantzakis believes that there is no middle ground. You can either embrace planning and thought, intellectualism, or you can embrace action, the key to which is folly.
Come on, don't be delicate.